So we've got an interesting panel. I won't say too much, I'll just try to get things moving quickly. But let me just very briefly introduce the panelists. On my left is Namrita Kapoor, who's in charge of corporate partnerships at Environmental Defence Fund. EDF is sort of an environmental NGO, which is a sort of market niche, has basically pioneered the whole area of collaboration between environmental groups and corporate entities in a way of trying to improve their environmental performance while also improving their bottom line. And then they took some very interesting high-profile cases. Next on is Curtis Ravenel, who graduated from business school in 2001. Curtis is at Bloomberg. A couple of years ago, Curtis started developing a new sustainability initiative as part of the product range at Bloomberg. Curtis is now responsible for that and running that. I'm sure we'll be talking about what that is and where it's going. It's a high-profile initiative at Bloomberg and a very interesting one from a CSR perspective. Next we've got Marlin Reeves, who's a senior partner and the head of the Strategy Institute at BCG, Boston Consulting Group. Actually, there's an interesting piece about BCG on the front page of today's Financial Times, which I was reading in the subway on the way up. It's about what looks like a very interesting report that I obviously haven't read it yet on onshore, claiming that the rise in labour costs in China and so on is actually making it attractive to bring back to the US many of the jobs which were outsourced to China a number of years ago. That's a very topical issue and certainly one which has a lot of CSR implications. And to my far left is Bruce Schlein, who's in charge of corporate sustainability at Citibank. Citibank is famous for many, many things, including a near-death experience in the financial field recently. But actually, as far as I'm concerned, it actually has a very, very long-standing, at least positive reputation in the CSR field. And was one of the pioneer banks in the area of the Equator Principles, which was a very interesting initiative and a very influential initiative in the banking field. So the way we're going to run this is we're going to ask each panelist just to talk for 5 minutes on the general topic of corporate responsibility and corporate innovations in the area of corporate responsibility. And then that'll take about 20 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion between the panelists for roughly another 20 minutes. And then finally, we'll take the last 20 minutes as Q&A with you guys in the audience. So I'll just move from left to right here. So Amrita, you want to go?
Sure. Thank you very much. And I recognize that we're in that dangerous spot between you and your cocktail, so I'll try to keep it brief and interesting at the same time. So in terms of the corporate partnership program, let me just give you a little context to understand kind of what our role is in pushing corporate responsibility. So about 20 years ago, before NGOs were partnering with companies, the lore is that Fred Krupp, our president, was out having a meal with his family at McDonald's, and at the end of the meal there was this big pile of trash in the center of the table. And one of his sons pointed at him and said, "Dad, can't you do something about this?" And so apparently that was sort of what kicked off what became our fledgling partnership with McDonald's. And it was viewed as very, very risky. Other environmental groups were calling us sellouts. The mainstream media was quoted as saying it was as if we were partnering with the mafia to reduce drug distribution. And then, fast forward, it ended up being very successful. After that first year of the partnership, 10 years later on, over that 10-year period, they reduced waste by 300 million tons. They recycled over 1 million tons of recycled cardboard, and a 30% reduction in their overall waste. Not to mention that this was all a net savings to them. And then even more importantly, you saw that it basically cascaded through the rest of the industry. And so that, sort of a microcosm is kind of how we think about corporate partnerships. We choose a market leader, identify an innovation, and demonstrate the business concept around it. And as one of our requirements in working with companies is that anything that's developed has to be shared, because we're about not just transforming that company, but we want to transform the whole industry. And we've seen a lot of successes over the years. And so now we see these days, even more so than the past, especially considering the fact that even in recessionary times, we see the Fortune 500, impressively enough, has still been pursuing these types of innovations and recognizing that it's not just a cost center. And so now our focus has shifted more to thinking about how do we go beyond Fortune 500 to the next 5,000. Because the next 5,000 is still considered, for the most part, a cost center. And so the way that we've been thinking about it currently and moving forward, and invite actually your suggestions about this, is through 3 types of leverage. One, we think about supply chain leverage. So an example there is working with Walmart. And so we pushed for 5 years until they finally took a commitment in 2010 to reduce their carbon emissions by 20 million tons by 2015 in their supply chain. So really critical. So using that leverage from Walmart, we're able to reach a whole range of different companies, and not just in the US, throughout the world. And that's where the real opportunity is for making a difference. Their internal footprint is really not that big. It's really their supply chain, which is where the opportunity is. Second is through what we call equity leverage. And so there we've been partnering with the likes of KKR and Carlyle Group. And there we're able to, again, through a single partner, reach a whole range of different portfolio companies. And again, been able to show that there's a lot of value to be had by using an environmental screen to look at their portfolio. And most importantly, it doesn't fundamentally change the business value of the business. So, unlike shutting down a facility, laying people off, these are efficiencies that they can see where they see a big return and don't affect that fundamental value. And then thirdly, we look at what we call network leverage, and appropriately for the conference theme. And this is more about recognizing that companies learn from companies, and that helps mitigate the risk. And so there we've developed this program called Climate Core, where we place students for the summer with companies to identify opportunities around energy efficiency. In fact, Citi had a student this past summer. And not only creating this network among the students, but also among the companies. And so we host now an annual conference after the end of the internship to bring together the companies and get them to understand how they can navigate the barriers that they've been dealing with and trying to not just think about energy efficiency. We've been calling energy efficiency kind of the gateway drug, because they'll get into the program that way, but then they start really wanting to understand, what does this mean about total energy management? So I'll stop there, but just leave you with sort of one question in terms of, so over our 20 years of doing this type of work, we've been able to prove the business case in spades time and again, but very rarely do we find that suggests the business case that will help cascade these things throughout business. And so these are some of those three different leverage avenues or ways that we've thought about to get sort of beyond the business case issue or get beyond the other barriers after the business case. But I'd love to hear from the other panelists as well as from the audience as to thoughts about what else should we be trying, because this is, for us, we want to sort of see this cascade throughout business.
Thanks, Narita. So you're basically providing free consulting services. So you're undercutting BCG. Get their reaction to that. Curtis.
Sure. Yes, my name is Curtis Ravenel. I run Bloomberg's Sustainability Strategy Group, and it has a couple of layers to it. I think that Bloomberg was, we like to think of ourselves as a forward-thinking firm, but in the area of sustainability and corporate social responsibility, if you will, we were behind. I look at the evolution of corporate sustainability. I personally, Jeff knows this, I don't like the term CSR because to me there's a connotation there that it is something you're doing outside of your business to repair something bad you've done within your business. Now, maybe that's not a fair interpretation, but I always got that feeling, and I felt that it undermined within some of the actual business units what you were trying to do, little eyeball rolling, etc. So, I think there was the social contract to start with, and Bloomberg had a very robust volunteer and giving program, philanthropy program. That's sustainability 1.0. And 2.0 is really when you look at operating efficiencies. You reduce your risk, you enhance your brand, you save a lot of money. And all of these things are very important to sort of triggering the idea that there's an opportunity to do good while doing well. Final sort of, and no one should say final, but the next stage, in some companies are starting to make this leap, and I think Bloomberg is one of them, is to, what's the opportunity? How do we solve a social problem while building a business at the same time? And obviously you're limited to what your strengths are as a business, but for Bloomberg that's data. You know, we have an incredible distribution amongst the financial community, and we're really trying to grow it beyond to the broader business community. And we're very good at taking asymmetric data sets and trying to make them a little more uniform, building a taxonomy and make it usable or actionable, to use our internal term, amongst different categories of folks. And I think that sustainability-related information, be it ESG data, environmental, social, governance, or any other what's traditionally called non-financial data, is actually very helpful data and will continue to grow in importance in helping to evaluate the true long-term potential of a firm. I think financial data is somewhat commoditized, and this new data set, whatever you want to call it, really does provide you insight into how companies manage. And we have seen a tremendous amount of interest. We've seen an increase of about 50% amongst our users globally looking at this data, and then 100% increase in the last year of how much data they're actually pulling out of the system. That is despite the fact that the data has a lot of holes in it. You've got about 20,000, we consider the investable universe to be about 20,000 firms actively traded on major exchanges around the world. And about in 2005, I think there was between 700 or 800 companies that disclosed sustainability data, we call it ESG data. And now there's about 5,000 or 6,000. The disclosure is not perfect, but thou shalt not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It is certainly moving in a very fast direction, both companies disclosing as well as financial institutions signing various agreements with NGOs, the UN Principles for Responsible Investing and Carbon Disclosure Project, et cetera, saying, I will use ESG data in my investment processes. So we think it's here to stay. And so I think really in the end that this migration from CSR as a sort of separate thing that a company does into really fully being integrated into everything that they do, both on the operating and on the business side as far as building businesses, is where Beyond CSR is headed.
Thank you. So I work at Boston Consulting Group. We have our own sort of sustainability initiatives and philanthropy initiatives, but we're not a huge firm, so we can achieve modest impact that way. I think the biggest impact for us is through helping clients, and the highest leverage is really through giving them the right ideas and tools so that they can help themselves have impact. So in the Strategy Institute, we're trying basically to create, to build a leverage theme, conceptual leverage. And let me just maybe share 6 observations on the ideas that we use to talk about this space. The first one is that the mantra of business strategists has always been, interestingly, sustainable, competitive advantage. It contains the word sustainable. But we have 2 small problems with that concept, the organizing concept of strategy. One of them is that it doesn't actually work anymore. The turnover of leadership positions in business has increased tenfold in some sectors. So leadership is not very permanent, even in a short-term economic sense. The other problem, of course, is that although it contains the word sustainable, it has very little to say about the social and ecological dimensions of business. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, at sort of sustainability, CSR, corporate responsibility conferences, we hear lots of words banded around which are very soft, very overlapping, and it's interesting, like our surveys would suggest that this is extremely important to companies. For instance, 40% of companies in our surveys claim to have changed their business model as a result of a sustainability concern. 68% say that it's important for fundamental competitiveness. 70% say they plan to do more in this direction. It's important, but it's very confused. One of the things we did in our last survey was ask them to define sustainability, and then we did a sort of semantic analysis of those definitions, and it's basically, it's not quite random, but it's somewhat random. And it's interesting that these 2 things are treated as separate things now. The biggest sustainability issue for most companies now is short-term economic sustainability, and we use one toolkit for that, and then we use a different language and a different organizational construct for the other stuff. So you know, our attempt to put these two things together is to say that a sustainable with a small s, i.e. something that sticks around, a sustainable business probably has to be adaptable to its environment on all time scales, short and long term, and in all spheres, the economic sphere, the social sphere, and the ecological sphere. Let me make a couple of assertions that we can come back to, if we like, in discussion. But we think that in order to do that, you've probably got to get 5 things right, which sound easy but are quite challenging in practice. One of them is adapting to something requires the processing of signals and patterns. So it requires signal processing, signal advantage, and of course in a data-overwhelmed world, especially in an ambiguous space like sustainability, that's not an easy thing. The second thing is it requires some sort of experimentation principle. We have to know whether what we're doing works or not, and of course we all know the problems with metrics and ambiguous terminology in that space. Third thing is it requires organizational flexibility. The most interesting definition of sustainability in this 4,000 data survey we did was somebody said it is the supply chain, it is supply chain elasticity, the ability of the supply chain to adapt to new economic circumstances derived from new social and ecological circumstances. So flexibility. The fourth one is systems, what we call systems advantage, which is the ability to actually collectively in multi-company ecosystems or multi-stakeholder systems create sustainable ecosystems. Often the unspoken assumption of strategy that the unit of analysis is the company is the problem. The unit of analysis can't be the company for collective problems. And the fifth one is social adaptation or social ecological adaptation, which is also on slower time scales, usually adapting to changing ecological and social circumstances. We think if you look at the people that got paid for doing the right thing, not only avoided going to jail for doing the wrong thing, but actually got paid for doing the right thing, it's not actually as random as it first seems. We think that there are 8 archetypes in 3 classes. So one class is, change your business model, substitute a scarce resource, for example. Another one is continuously evolve your business model, and that's a whole set of skills that most companies are not set up to deal with. And the third class of models basically says, put yourself in a relationship of mutual trust with strong signaling with your other stakeholders, so that even if you don't know what you need to do next, you will continuously receive signals about what you need to do to evolve. So the last thing I'll point out is some people have asserted that doing the right thing gets rewarded. I think I can prove to you that that is absolutely not the case. For example, if I dissolved BCG tomorrow and put all of the capital into children's playgrounds, I'm sure I would have created some social good, but I wouldn't really have a sustainable business model. So not automatic, but actually, if you measure the adaptiveness along the lines that I've suggested, actually we think that since about 1985, there's been a fairly steep takeoff in the extent to which the market actually rewards sustainable actions in all 3 spheres, including the economic sphere.
Thanks very much, Nick. Martin. Bruce, over to you.
So good afternoon. I'm going to start just by telling a pre-city story, and a story that in many respects brought me to city. I spent 2 years working with Bechtel on a project in China. It was a large infrastructure project, a petrochemical plant. And I was responsible for meeting that project's environmental and social commitments, which, as was referenced earlier, in the financial community, there are environmental and social standards through shared principles like Equator that get covenanted into financings and then get passed down to clients and contractors and the like. And so I was the recipient of one of those plans for managing environmental and social issues. And I tell this story for a couple of reasons to point out, I think, some really interesting challenges and opportunities. And the story is really about my first couple of weeks on this project, which was when I showed up there. It was a July 4th picnic on this compound of about 1,000 professional expatriates, engineers, contract managers, procurement specialists, and the like, and about 30,000 skilled and unskilled laborers who were building this project. And I sat down at a table with some peers, and I told them what I did. I told them what my title was. I'm the sustainability manager for the project, and dead silence, blank stares. Nobody knew at all what I was talking about. Why is that important? Well, because one of the most important things I think about CSR is that that there is a huge onus, I think, on those of us who work in this field to drill down as far as possible, not just in our organizations, but also where the rubber hits the road, where the community impact or the environmental impact is actually taking place. And I think that tends to be one of the gaps or one of the challenges in this field, which is it sometimes stays at certain levels within an organization, and it's challenging to embed it, especially deeply into an organization. The second thing that happened to me was that this project was a joint venture between Shell and CNOOC. So I worked for a company that was hired by this joint venture, a 50% Chinese, 50% Dutch-British joint venture. They had remarkably different views and perspectives on what CSR was, what to call it, what the priorities should be, how to interpret it, how to implement it. And I think this is particularly important, and again, an opportunity and a challenge perhaps for those of you who have either multinational or international backgrounds or aspirations, and that is that there are a growing number of companies from emerging markets that are either multinationals today or have aspirations to be multinationals, who are facing challenges and expectations around CSR. And I think the opportunities and challenges are multifold. One is, I think it's going to challenge us to ask whether our assumptions and approaches about, let's call it, I know we don't like the word CSR, but for lack of a better word right now, let's just say, challenge our assumptions and approaches. Do we have the right assumptions and approaches? Is a Western view on all this the right view, the only view? And I think, the simple answer to that is no. And so I think there's a great opportunity here for people working in Western multinationals to think about how they will partner with and collaborate with emerging market and other multinationals. And an equally interesting opportunity for those of us or you who might work for emerging market multinationals who are thinking about what does CSR mean if you are an Indian company operating a coal mine in the United States and wanting to think about what CSR means in those communities. I think the two are really interestingly linked in the sense that the 2 points that I'm making, in that I often see at the community level that the CSR approach, at least on the, and I'm generalizing here, but it's often the approach that the CSR approach is a unidirectional one, which is the company has the answers and they are offering or imposing those to a community. That the training takes place, that it's the community that needs to adapt to the company, that the training is all about capacity building of the community so that they can, effectively interact and benefit from whatever this interaction is. And I actually think there's a tremendous opportunity, and I think our colleague from BCG made this point when he talked about the sort of signals and being receptive to signals and adapting and responding to them. But I think, flip that on its head, right? Maybe the community should be educating and capacity building the company so that the company is better situated and more effective in its interactions, or it's a mutual exchange. So I think I'll pause there. I mean, I would like to, I haven't really talked at all about Citi. I'd like to share a few remarks about Citi, but maybe I can do that in the comments. But I think two great opportunities, right? Emerging markets and really drilling down, not just within your organization, but where does the rubber hit the road? What are the real issues? How do you understand those issues and how they intersect with the company and do so in an effective way?
Let me actually just pick up your last point, Bruce, and put it to the panel as a whole. this is not quite what you were saying, but we can kind of extend it a little bit. I mean, is CSR a Western concept? Our country, we have an increasing number of multinationals from India, from China, from a range of other non-Western countries. Do they share our perspective on CSR, or will they come to share our perspective on CSR? Or is it a phenomenon which is driven largely by Western values, Western civil societies and NGOs and so on?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Because we've done a good amount of work in China because of our work with Walmart. And I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't, even in this country, so obviously we have more of an ethic around CSR, but in terms of what really helped it take hold was the whole aligning incentives and being able to put a business case and sort of recognizing that there was, even though this is good for the environment, good for the community, it was good for business. And that's what sort of really broke it out somewhat from its silos of being a PR piece. And so it's been interesting to see the reaction when we start to pilot things in other countries. And so China, I'll give you one example. We've been focusing on what sort of system we could embed in supply chains around energy efficiency. So Walmart being the case in point. And so we've we've created this methodology so that in factories in China that Walmart sources from, that they can quickly identify opportunities for energy efficiency. And when we first walked in the door and the company was told that we were here at the behest of Walmart, they kind of had a perma smile on their face. They're like, great, what does Walmart want now? And what was interesting is how quickly the look on their face changed as they started realizing that the things we were talking about were going to save them money and were going to be better for their business. And they were very excited about it. And especially in the context of China, factories are very inefficient. So projects that they were identifying were, in some cases, 6-month payback periods, which it was a no-brainer that they were going to do that. And the wonderful thing from their perspective, because we were there at the behest of Walmart, was that Walmart was going to make them more of a long-term supplier and help make their business more sustainable. Even not necessarily very long-term, but longer term. So our little experience is showing that in terms of sort of it actually taking hold, it's still kind of tied into the economics. And I think that's probably going to be a similar trend that you're going to see in emerging market companies, because let's face it, that is often a paramount issue for them.
Yeah.
Clearly there's a sense in which it's a very Western concept, the words, the organizations, the watchdogs, the regulations. But in a couple of senses it isn't, I think. I think in terms of excellence, I think the West doesn't have the monopoly. We just did a report with the World Economic Forum identifying emerging market champions of sustainability. We identified 16 companies that we thought were world-class, probably the best in the world on certain dimensions, and were profiting and growing very heavily as a result of that. Zhangzidao, the Chinese aquaculture company, is probably using some of the most advanced multi-trophic, non-polluting and high productivity aquaculture. Cerise Cement in India is probably at the leading edge of cement energy conservation technology. So we don't have a monopoly in excellence, I think. I think also in terms of the underlying concept, I think the reason, if you like, it's my personal interpretation, but the reason why perhaps in the US we had to stress the existence of this concept is that it was alien for a while to a very sort of one-dimensional concept of corporate capitalism we had, namely that the only thing that mattered was total shareholder return and investor returns. And we realized that wasn't quite the answer, so we had to sort of supplement it. I think Europe to some extent, and in my experience, Asia more generally, has always had a sort of more multi-dimensional concept of responsibilities of corporations, and therefore in terms of underlying thinking and philosophies, I think it's already there in some sense. And the third comment I'd make is one very particular dimension of whatever we want to call the sustainable CSR zoo is of course economic access. I mean, the fact is that certain demographic segments don't have access to certain parts of the product market space today, and I think the emerging markets are a hothouse of business model innovation for access to market and market solutions to social problems. And so we'll actually see a lot of leading innovations coming out of the emerging markets. But we are already, I think.
I'll just maybe just going back to this example, my colleagues that I worked with at CNOOC, their priority in this realm was employment opportunities, and on the Shell side, it was primarily around the environment and sustainability. So, you know, the sorts of things that we were doing. On the one hand, we were coastal, so we were adjusting the lights so that we weren't attracting sea turtles who were attracted by the lights. We turned them around. That was, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we were very focused at the behest of our CNOOC colleagues on employment, and reconciling their interests was a fascinating exercise, and one that was more often than not not a shared set of priorities and values.
Let me just ask you a question, kind of one more very general question. What do you think is going to happen to CSR between now and 2020? How will this space look roughly 10 years from now? Will it be more quantitative? Will we get more, for example, one of the things that as a little bit of an outsider looking in, I always see is that it's hard getting decent quantitative data. Maybe Curtis's operation is going to change that. But comparing CSR reporting with conventional financial reporting, it's really black and white. It's a very unsatisfactory situation there. And GRI is a move in that direction, but it's not a particularly impressive one in a lot of ways. Do you foresee more quantification, more standardization in the way we look at CSR? Because one of the mantras in business schools is what gets measured gets managed. At the moment, most of this stuff isn't very well measured, and that makes it hard to manage.
My point of view is absolutely. We, at Bloomberg, we've sort of flipped the way we present this information to the investors, flipped on its head from the way it's traditionally presented, in that right now, even the most advanced reporters give you about 70 pages of context and reports about what they're doing well, and they might mention some of the things they're not doing all that well. On the back, they have their numbers. The way Bloomberg presents it is the other way around. We put the numbers up front, and our system allows you to click on the number and drill through for context, because that's the way the financial community consumes things. They look at the numbers first, and then they go to the MD&A, all right? And they look at the other things to get more context. So I don't think you can have one without the other. And this is a kind of something that I've been thinking about for a while too. I'm not sure whether or not, there's a lot of people that will push back on this move towards quantification, because not everything should be quantified, they'll say, and monetized, and there's some value in that. But however, if you really do want to move the world towards more of an economic model in which these issues are included in the way a business is run and the way an investor sees that business, you have to quantify it. It's an externality right now. That's the problem, right? And this is their EDF's big mantra. You don't, it's the law of commons. You have to quantify that thing. The financial community only knows how to work with numbers. And they want to know, if you're a portfolio manager and analyst, how is this going to affect my share price in 5 years? How does this affect my valuation using a DCF model? So, we're building some tools right now that will help that. The underlying problem is it's a little chicken and egg. You got to have data, and you have to have, I always joke about this because the quants will say, yeah, I'd love to see that data, that's great. And then they look and they see that it's, they look at a sector and it's half full and it's only got some history, and even the data that's there is not quite the same cost company, and they just throw their hands up, They, rightly or wrongly, they need 10 years of history, full sector information, and across regions. And it reminds me of the conversation we were having earlier about energy efficiency and the opportunity to sort of scale that, is that you can't go back and create that data. You just have to wait. Good news is that more and more firms are quantifying this every single day, and that in 5 years or so, and I know we've been saying this for 5 years or so, there will be enough data. There's just so much momentum and so many different groups. State Street just announced that they were going to do a super KPI project. KPI, key performance indicators around ESG factors. And the last thing I'll say on that is that ESG factors, being the data that I use to look at sustainability, cannot be looked at alone. It has to be contextualized not only through explanation, written explanation, but integrated with operating data and financial data. And I would argue that all of those different data are not very helpful alone, and that you really need to integrate them. And that's where I see it going. And hopefully I feel like there's a lot of momentum towards that, and I'm sure Bruce would agree, since he has to report all this stuff all the time. Right.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit too about, more of your question about the 20-year horizon, what to see there. I think what we'll probably see is more of what we've seen in a few leadership situations where companies start recognizing that for their long-term survival, that they can't afford not to focus on these issues, that resource scarcity is happening, is here, and for many of them is already affecting their supply chains and their way of doing business. And I'll give one example, not someone that we've worked with directly, but Unilever. So Unilever recognized very early on that in their sourcing of food products in particular, that if they didn't start to develop more sustainable sources of that, start sort of really getting in the dirt, if you will, in these different countries to source their products and provide the technical assistance, that they weren't going to have enough product to be able to sell. And so they've spent a lot of effort now on trying to develop that and doing technical assistance with farming organizations around the world. And the other thing that the CEO did that was very interesting and is moving the company away in its investor base from this short-termness issue is that he suspended doing quarterly calls, which is a huge risk, obviously. It takes a great deal of courage. And when he was asked, well, then what's going to happen to your investors? And he said, well, I'd rather have investors who are focused on the long term rather than the short term. And so something like that, I think, is sort of what the trend is that you'll see more and more companies coming to that sort of realization and doing things that allow them to think about their business in the 10 to 20 year time frame rather than quarter by quarter time frame.
I think in addition to the things the other speakers said, I think we'll see a move towards a more a move back towards a more multi-stakeholder model of capitalism. So it'll be about numbers, but it will be about more people looking at those numbers too. I think there's also some interesting governance issues. I think CSR, which is very sort of socially and compliance biased, and sustainability, which is the ecologically biased concept, that we broadened to cover any risk, any adaptive risks. For instance, I think the big one that's coming out of the US is unemployment. That will be a major sort of issue of social concern, and it will be in the boardroom. It's not really in the boardroom. It's in the boardroom in some places yet. I mean, the chief sustainability officer is not a university sort of first line position yet. And I also think as far as I can tell, the largest growing institutional type species on Earth is actually the NGO. And I think clearly there's a counterbalance to the corporate world and helping to guide the corporate world with social and ecological issues. There's a lot of value and good intentions there, but it's very fragmented. Governance there is extremely heterogeneous and sort of non-existent in some places. So I think we've got a new type of governance problem, the governance problem of the watchdogs, if you like, coming up, and we have to agree on how we're going to measure things, who measures the measurers, and so on. And actually, we have the technologies to do that. Think about the business models of people like Amazon and eBay. They've worked out the technology of scaling trust through raters and rating systems. So I think we know how to do that. We just have to leverage those technologies. Those would be some of the things that I see as being quite different on a 10-year horizon.
Can I just add one point based on that comment about the NGOs? So one of I'm agreeing with you actually. And so where it's been sort of playing out most recently is something that's sort of a huge opportunity when we think about advancing companies, there's a group that was created called the Sustainability Consortium, and it is 65 plus consumer good companies. Of course, Walmart is one of them. And so this is a tremendous platform, and they've all come together agreeing that they're going to create reporting systems for their supply chains, and that they'll be sort of releasing these. And we as the NGO community are, so we're frothing at the mouth because, hey, we've got 65 plus companies that we have the opportunity to influence, but we're not coordinated. And so, how do we go about working together so that we're not just these gnats on the side of this large platform? And so that has been a challenge, and I think will continue to be.
Just one more comment to that, if I may, which is, I think that there are some huge opportunities in the sort of non-profit space, if you like, and where huge needs that are not kind of big. One of them is, I think, a marketplace for corporate volunteerism. Right now, corporations have good intentions. They try not to cause harm. They try to act in their own interests. They try to create social good. But where are the supply signals? Where's the marketplace of matching the things that need to be done with the things that are done? We need a new way of social commitments out there, because you find, for instance, I've done some work in HIV, and the problem in HIV is not that we don't have enough money on drugs. We have too much uncoordinated activity on the wrong things. We need a marketplace of some sort.
Bruce, can we make any remarks about Citibank, please?
Just quickly, I think with respect to the role of data and the issue of governance, I think this question of principles and standards and their degree of specificity is going to be really important. And I think we see value, just to give two examples, we're signatories to the Global Compact. We think that is an important set of principles, but it's an important signal and stake in the ground, but also challenging in terms of how do you translate that? How do I translate that for my colleagues? How do I build metrics and reporting around that? Whereas something like the Equator Principles, which is very specific, it's a set of shared principles across the private banking sector for environmental and social diligence around project finance, is something that's specific and measurable, and that we're able to build policies and procedures around. And I think the need to translate standards and principles into more specific things that can be measured and governed and understood in terms of there being a level playing field for those who are subscribing and adopting them is going to be important.
And I just want to make one quick comment on that as well. One is we couldn't agree more. We really believe, if you look at LEED for design for buildings, before LEED there was a lot of fragmentation around what was a green building, and once a standard was chosen, now you can quibble with some of what LEED does, but overall it's pretty good. You would not see in any major city any new commercial real estate building being built that was not to LEED standard. And so standards have the ability to accelerate adoption, and that is really important. So we are backing lots of different organizations that are standard setting. And I do think that, to answer your question about 2020, is that sustainability reporting, what that standard is, if GRI approves or any of these other things, will be mandatory. It'll be required, I think, legally in various different forms, either definitely at the European level, if not even by the SEC here by 2020. I think the SEC alone doesn't want to, particularly right now, be seen as a leader on something like this, nor can they be considered a laggard. At some point, there's going to be a lot of information out there that is affecting investors' decisions, and they have to sort of manage that. And so I think you'll see it as a statutory regulatory requirement by 2020.
Okay, thanks, guys. So we've got about 15 minutes left. We started a bit late, so we'll finish a little bit late. That's okay with everybody. And I'd like to use those last 15 minutes for Q&A with the audience. What I'm going to do is take questions two at a time. So we need two people. I've already seen multiple hands. Yeah, lady over there, I think you had a hand up early. So And then there was a gentleman here, yes, sir. You two guys, you could, you know, wait, why don't you kick off and you guys decide which of you are going to... No, okay. Okay, why don't you give us a question?
Okay, you were mentioning standard setting. However, those who set the standards are usually government officials. So how do you guys plan to work with government? Like, how do you plan to address that issue? The fact of, I forgot my question.
Well, I hear what you're saying about government officials and standard setting, but in this particular case, it's not at all the case. The NGOs actually have been the total thought leaders on this. And the GRI is a framework for reporting on sustainability, but it doesn't have the specificity. I think Bruce and I would both agree. I think both of us do GRI reports. It doesn't have the specificity that is needed. However, there are other standards within that framework that are emerging. The CDP has their standards around carbon disclosure. UNPRI is requiring its own standards. There is a convergence, and one of the goals in our view, and I'm going to spend the better part of 2012 working with the NGO community to try and harmonize these standards that frankly are very close in what they're trying to achieve. So I don't think it is government. When government is ready, we will take the set of standards, particularly if industry and the financial community and NGOs get together and say, this is the standard, guys, right? The car's already left, the garage on this one. So we will work with the government, of course, when the time comes. But the government will always be a little bit behind. Even once there's a government standard, it'll be less than what everybody wants. And so there'll always be supplemental information that people will want. And given the rise of global information age, most companies will be able to give it to them.
Any other comments on this? Bruce? So let's start again.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the 10-year-out question a slightly different way, and the question would be the following. What percentage of large companies in the US 10 years from now will have actually eliminated the position of head of CSR, not because they don't get it, but because they do get it, and they've moved to what I think Kurt has quite nicely called CSR 3.0, where it's essentially what they do, whether you call it Porter shared value, that they've moved to a model in which having separate CSR just doesn't make sense. And again, sorry for the two guys here who have that position, they don't need you anymore.
Take one more question to vote. Is that you want to pass it? I'll leave Chris.
So my question was about investing into innovative ecosystems. So one way of thinking about CSR is, say, for a company like Shell, which is energy giant, they could invest in a sustainable business model coming out of a small district in some state that's setting up solar panels in a particular area of that state. Why don't big companies look at this sort of investing as one of their primary CSR methods?
So two other different questions there, guys. One on CSR mainstreaming and sort of dropping it as a separate function and really incorporating it in corporate strategy. I think is what your institute is all about, basically. And then secondly, whether big companies could make more active use of investing in small startups with a high sort of CSR content. Who wants to go? You want to kick on?
Sure. Well, management practices change very slowly. So I think some companies get this. They think about these issues primarily in terms of the sustainability of their business models, and they're de-specializing the concepts. I think I think probably we're still on a wave of rising specialization, and my guess is that we'll probably speak a lot of companies whose first step will be to create that position before they eliminate it. So the position may be the last thing to go. These guys are doing such a good job that on the ecosystem point, actually this to me is the most interesting question in strategy, because if you ask the strategy question as how do you create advantage positions within advantaged ecosystems, as far as I'm aware, there's no answer. There's no textbook. There are some companies that are very, very good at it. Apple, eBay, Li & Fung, they actually have adaptive multi-stakeholder ecosystems. You could ask that Toyota always had a bit of that. If you ask them, what principles and thinking is that based upon? we don't really have the managerial software to think about those questions. That's actually one of our big research projects. We think that's going to be a big new frontier in management. So the answer to your question would be because it's, well, for instance, I was talking to one of those largest information companies, and I asked the head of strategy, what was the biggest unsolved problem in strategy, and he essentially said, look, we know that it sometimes pays to give things away, IP away, to create ecosystems which can then create tremendous value. We know that that's sometimes profitable for us. Why and how, we have no idea. That's the reason.
Yeah, I'll say thanks. Actually, I think it was one of your executives at Citi that was talking about the CSO position. Bruce, I can't remember who it was, the lunchtime speaker, and he was talking about how he knows a company really gets it when the CSO person has a direct line to the CEO, and that and so I think that's not so much the elimination of the position, but who's the position reporting to is really the key to watch. And then in terms of investing, you'd be actually surprised about how many companies actually do have R&D divisions that are doing the type of investing that you're suggesting. Whether it's an energy company that's investing in a small solar startup type of thing, or car companies. Car companies have had for, 30 years at least, fuel cell initiatives within them. And so you see it pretty much across the board. But I think maybe what you're getting is like how to accelerate that more and sort of realize that that's an opportunity. And I'm not quite sure what the way is to accelerate it, but one thing that we've been focusing on to try and sort of promote innovation in issues that are really difficult and that companies haven't been able to solve through these R&D investments is a partnership we recently created with a company called Innocentive. And it's a Massachusetts-based company. And so what they do is they've got this huge network of like 200,000 solvers, they call them. And a company will put up, and so in our case we've been trying to encourage companies to put up some sort of an environmental challenge. So say P&G wants to change the formulation of Tide to remove any chemicals of concern, but wants to maintain the cleanliness components of the product. And so then they'll put that challenge out to this community and provide a cash prize if someone rewards it. And so the whole idea there is that it's probably all the efforts on innovation within the company aren't working. And so you really have to kind of to think out of the box, and one way to think out of the box is get a completely different cross-section of people looking at this type of issue. And there's a company that's about to post something on Innocentive, but what we've done is we've sponsored a couple of challenges ourselves that are directly environmental. So one issue we've been dealing with is nitrogen pollution. And so we've posted a couple of challenges with really small dollar amounts, $7,500, and have gotten back some phenomenal responses about how to think about changing issues around nitrogen pollution that we're actively going to be now trying to move forward.
Right, okay, a couple more questions here, lady there.
I'd like to take you down a little bit of a side road. My name is Laura Rosen. I'm with an organization called GBC Health, and we work with major corporations to get them to leverage their assets to address some of the major global health challenges. And so my question is this. So often sustainability is synonymous with, I think Martin made this point, synonymous with environmental issues. And what I'd like to throw out there is that environmental sustainability and human sustainability are intertwined and cannot be separated. So human sustainability, primarily talking about health. Have you, but very often there's a sustainability department or initiative or officer at an organization, and the health-focused folks are relegated to HR or some other more marginalized, less strategic-looking area. Obviously, in terms of resource optimization, the two have to come together. Have you seen, I'm not quite sure who this question is for, maybe Martin or Namrita, although you have the word environment in your organization, so you're probably excused, but have you seen any changes in mindset within the companies with which you work, or behavior about starting to integrate both environmental and human sustainability, either within their own company or across other organizations.
One more question, please. Anybody else? Could you stand up?
Yeah. A lot of CSR seems to be about checklists and standards and stuff. And I was wondering how much of a influence you think the office culture or the social atmosphere of a corporation plays into it. And if so, do you know programs that are working on that aspect of it as well?
Two other different questions. One on the sort of combining the social and the environmental dimensions of CSR, sustainability, and the other on corporate culture and CSR. Who wants to pick up on those? Yeah, sure. Brendan, Bruce.
Oh no, please.
So you probably can't see this, but this slide contains it's a word map of 4,000 definitions of sustainability, and this area shaded in red in the center is the weighting towards environmental. So you can see that two things from this: that everybody that uses the word sustainability means something slightly different, but by and large they mean environmental and health. I couldn't even read from here actually, so I'd agree with your contention, and it sort of needs to be in there because the sustainability issue of the company is whatever could threaten its sustainability, right? And I can give a wonderful example in relation to that. I mean, we were doing some conversations with a Latin American food processor, a very large company, and they were really surprisingly expert and fluent in CSR and sustainability, and they were measuring everything, and they were GRI compliant, and you name it. We looked through their metrics, and guess what? The only thing that they weren't measuring was child obesity. You know, Mexico, I believe, is the world champion in child obesity. This was a food processing company, not measuring the one issue that could probably bankrupt it in the next 5 years. Or, so I think these, whatever we end up calling this word zoo, this is touches on the second question, it has to be focusing on the issues that threaten the ability of the company to stick around, which is anything where it's created an imbalance with its broader environment. And I think it's a long way from happening. So certainly health. At a conference I was at the other day, somebody stood up and said, "What about the internal human environment? You know, health and safety internally." And everybody said, "What's that got to do with sustainability?" So we've got a long way to go ahead.
So we do some integration. I think there's opportunities to do more, but I certainly collaborate a lot with my colleagues who work on the community development side of the organization. We look at the role of sustainability from the environmental perspective in terms of what we're financing in community assets, be it affordable housing, looking at studies and metrics around the impact of greening those assets on asthma rates, on emergency room visits, things like that. So we do some of that. Certainly, I think your point's well taken. Could be done more. And then I think also on the environmental risk side of things, when we're looking at how we integrate environmental and social risk. I mean, certainly, issues around emissions related to particular financing is always considered in the context of what are the health-related impacts of those emissions. So some integration, but I think your point's well taken. There could be more.
I'll try to answer yours in the back. It's funny, we spend an inordinate amount of time actually on employee education, and Bloomberg has all these famous free pantries. For many of you who've been there, we have a lot of free food. And, we have tried to change what we serve. We've implemented an aggressive composting program. We've got getting rid of bulk packaging. On the environmental side, that stuff is really small on our environmental impact, but it's the one thing that every single employee is involved in. So it's become a fantastic engagement tool. And I do agree that this is moving a very large ship, and that we have language problems among others. And really, in the end, success will depend on individuals taking initiative. and really pushing the ship forward. So any chance you have to build a really robust internal tool, I think is really critical, because they end up taking it elsewhere. You know, we hear stories all the time about people who changed the way they live, they brought it to their community, they're now bothering their neighbors, you know, and that kind of thing. That's sort of the, you know, the viral effect, if you will. So I think it's really important from an educational tool.
Even though you excused me from answering the first question, I will give a few comments about it. One is, one of the challenges, I think, for getting the social and governance issues more incorporated is metrics. The metrics aren't as far along as they are on the environmental side, and so that's where the efforts have to be done in order to see that side catch up at all. And then also, I guess, a sign of hope, if you will, is the sustainability consortium that I was mentioning. It does consider sustainability beyond environment, and in fact, that's been one of our efforts in trying to create NGO engagement around that. But frankly, you know, it was really hard to find social organizations that were interested in that were already kind of working on it. And you know, especially an organization that has Walmart as one of its largest players, you'd be kind of shocked, right? Because I mean, the social issues are really what put Walmart in the forefront of this problem. And I don't know if they're participating in a different aspect of it or a different avenue, and are still on sort of the full front advocacy side of things, and so the idea of collaborating isn't there. But there is an education that needs to be done still with the social organizations to get them more involved in this issue. Excuse me. And then on corporate culture, in some ways that goes back to my original question about we find that business case is not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient, and so that's why a program like Climate Corps, where, you know, for how educated these MBA students are that are going in there, we're only giving them 3 days of training, and they're finding, you know, $500,000 of savings in these companies after 3 days of trainings and 10, 12 weeks. Something's going on that they're helping influence corporate culture and changing decision making, and so that's really sort of where the issue is more about mainstreaming everything in ESG, is addressing corporate culture. And it's interesting, one of the, time and again, so it's really, really hard for us to recruit Climate Corps companies, which personally I think is astonishing, considering the return on investment is just out of control for these companies. And once they're in, then they're sold, and their implementation rate is huge. But a lot of these companies have said that often the argument that gets them in is because it's a great recruiting tool for employees. So it's interesting that even on that sort of kind of superficial level, that it's very important to them.
I guess we've just got time for one more round of questions. A couple more questions really briefly. Lady at the back here, please. Keep it really brief if you could.
Sure.
Thanks.
Hi. I work for an organization called Ashoka, which is the world's largest body of social entrepreneurs, and I'm wondering, with the organizations that you work with that have very sort of deep supply chains and distribution networks, do you feel that there is a legitimate opportunity for those organizations to partner with deeply entrenched social entrepreneurs and not-for-profit organizations that have the capacity to reach into communities and sort of tap latent resources that perhaps corporations can't? And is this sort of a potential source of innovation in embedding sort of social value creation in your core business practices, or is it sort of a nice thought, tough to do, maybe down the line?
No more questions. That's correct. Fine. You just focus on that one. So you got a question?
Just to, you were talking about like the social aspect of things. There are a lot of social initiatives that are working. One thing I want to highlight is that we don't work together. I work for Social Accountability International. We're another one of those standards organizations that are out there that are proliferating the market. But if you had time, if you could explain maybe some of the social things that you are doing, not within your company, like here in New York or whatever, but I mean within your supply chain, because labor has been integrated into so many different aspects. Like now with the International Finance Corporation, the Performance Center 2 focuses specifically on labor. And people are starting to look at it as a way to, like, you know, weigh the invisible assets of the company. And anyway, you know what I'm trying to say. So I have a lot to say.
Speak up on this.
I mean, I'll take a first crack. I think to your first question, I think there is opportunity, but I sadly think it is later down the line. I think it's a bandwidth issue, and the NGOs that have, you know, that are large enough to have a presence in multiple supply chain areas are the one, and have the relationships on the ground are the ones that these multinationals go to first. Now, if you team up with some of those large multinational NGOs, I think that that's probably an avenue forward. And with standards, with the social question about that and the measurement, it kind of ties into everything we were saying. It is, you know, I think from a lot of the companies still do, public companies especially, some of it is being driven by the SRI community, and investors have an easier time quantifying environmental stuff than they do quantifying social stuff. It's hard for me to say if I change the terrible snacks that are in my pantry that I'm going to see a quick return on my investment due to worker productivity. I can theorize about it and I can talk about it, but it's really hard to actually measure it. Whereas, you know, when I change the variable speed fan drives at Bloomberg, I can measure the reduction in my energy right away, and I can see that there is a return. So I don't, it's not to be discouraged. I think, you know, we've taken hundreds of years to mess up financial accounting. So let's give ourselves a little bit of break. I think that we're much more capable now, and that the measurement for those things are coming.
I think I'm very optimistic about certain types of social entrepreneurship in this space. In particular, I see a lot of innovations coming out of businesses in emerging markets, essentially profitable ways of reaching new demographic tiers. You know, the Manila Water Company is a great example, for example, of actually reducing water leakage massively, i.e. water theft, reducing the price of water, because the theft is by people that sell the water at inflated prices to impoverished communities, creating capillary distribution, actually, you know, getting the water to those places, creating businesses around protecting the water supply lines and building them in the local communities. Now, is that where most NGOs are focused today? My impression is not, but I think there's a codification and best practice sharing and standard setting sort of role, so that those innovations diffuse very quickly. And I think there are a lot of them. You know, microfinance is very well known. I think capillary distribution is another. Sort of ultra low cost models is another. Sort of you know, business models which actually involve the community building a business model. So inclusive business models is another. And some people are really good at it, but these are not widely diffused. So innovation diffusion, I think, is a huge opportunity.
Well, I'll just echo what Curtis said, that for us, for the most part, and we don't work outside of the U.S., and where we do, so we only have 2 outside of the U.S. offices, one in Mexico and one in China. But other than that, any efforts we're doing in India, Vietnam, Brazil, it's all about partnering with the local organizations. There's no way that we would be able to have a sort of cultural understanding, the contacts, the type of distribution channels that a local organization would have. And so, yeah, we're not, we try to demur from setting up any sort of establishment outside of the U.S.
Okay, well, sadly we're out of time, but so let me bring things to a close by thanking Chris over there who put this panel together, and thanking the panelists for being here. Thank you very much.